Welcome to Web3 with A6 and Z, our show about building the next generation of the internet. Sonal here, back again, and Robert and I decided to do an episode on what we're reading here at A6 and Z Crypto. Since our team just released our annual summer reading list, you can find the latest and past lists linked in the show notes and on a6nzcrypto.com. We thought it would be fun to do a hallway-style chat among the editorial team, and so also asked editors Steph Zinn and Tim Sullivan to join us as well. Whether you're working or vacationing, hopefully there's something in this special summer holiday episode that sparks interest for you too. By the way, we have new show art as well. In the conversation that follows, we not only discuss books that we and others here are reading, including books that come up on our list every time, but also talk about why audiobooks, modes of reading, genres, talk about pseudonymous authors to royal authors to Shakespeare, to religion, science fiction, and much, much more. But we begin by briefly talking about the list itself. The first voice you'll hear is Robert's, followed by Steph's, me, and then Tim.
By the way, every person on our team who submits a book first says, I know this isn't good for the list. And I go, no, it is great for the list.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't have to be a crypto book. It doesn't have to be an entrepreneurship book. It just has to be a book that you liked.
Yeah. I mean, there is not a lot of posturing. People recommend books that are of any age. It's not like, here's the latest book on this, or like, here's something that's coming out this year that I'm excited about. There's like classics on there. We have John Steinbeck, but also newer publications, Annie Jacobson's Nuclear War. They're kind of like all over the place. And I think that's really refreshing, honestly. I do think that like it encourages more people to contribute as well. Like once I saw the first reading list, I was like, oh, I can contribute. But I mean, I haven't contributed this time, but once I saw the first reading list, I was like, oh, I can contribute books. Like I'm allowed to talk about what I like here instead of, something that I think I should have read.
Yeah.
I figured I would just ask you all, what are you reading?
Well, what if we're not reading?
Well, that's highly possible too.
We're too busy working to read. No, I'm just kidding.
It's a trick question.
Some of you guys are new parents, so that can also eat into reading time.
I'm an old parent, so I'm reading. I'm reading Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans.
That's Kazuo Ishiguro, right?
Yep. He wrote Remains
Never
of
Let
the
Me Go.
Day, Never Let Me Go. This is nominally about England's greatest detective, self-proclaimed greatest detective, I think set in the 30s and 40s. And the language is very formal, so I'm reading it in very short chunks.
Is it actually good? I don't mean to make myself not sophisticated, but I find formal writing very annoying.
I mean, you have to be in the mood to read the very formal sentences and the reflections. It's much more formal than I think even like Remains of the Day, which, centers on a butler, so it has a certain formality to it. It's less formal than like Never Let Me Go. So it's definitely something you have to be in the mood for. And of course, he's an unreliable narrator. But it's fascinating to kind of watch how the story unfolds. It's the second time I've read it, so I know the narrator is full of crap. And so it's interesting to see how that's developed over the course of the novel, where you realize the author is fooling you as you read through it the second time.
My favorite unreliable narrator books by far are Talented Mr. Ripley.
Oh.
What's her name? Patricia Highworth.
Highsmith.
Highsmith.
Did you watch the Netflix series?
Oh, no, I didn't know. I saw the movie.
But
Wait,
there
there's
is
a
a
Netflix series?
There's a new series on Netflix. It's called Ripley, and it is fantastic.
Oh my
it's
God, I'm
shot
gonna add
in
it.
black and white, and the cinematography is absolutely outstanding. I was actually reading a book when my wife was watching it, and I was like, I'm not going to pay attention to this.
Yeah.
And then I could not move my eyes off the screen. I was so entranced.
So wait, why is it black and white? So they're going for like a vintage feel?
There's so many textures and like interesting shots. And I think, well, if you watch it, you'll see like Caravaggio, the Renaissance painter, is like a big part of it. And he does a lot of stuff with shadow work. I think like the Italian word is chiaroscuro. I don't know. I don't know Italian.
Chiaroscuro.
Say that again?
Emphasis was wrong on that, but it was chiaroscuro.
Okay, there you go.
Oh.
Thank you.
I didn't know that was how to pronounce it either. I've never known how to pronounce that word.
So anyway, I think
The more you know.
I think they went with this sort of like black and white to highlight the nature of good and evil, dark and light, and also as a callback to Caravaggio and that word that I can't pronounce.
That's kind of brilliant. I mean, in the last reading list, I'm sorry, in the last what we're watching, because we did include TV shows when we did our list. I put Perry Mason.
Oh, the new one.
Yes, the new one, the one that
so dark.
Robert Downey Jr.'s production company produced. And I read every single one of the Perry Mason books as a kid because my grandfather immigrated to Uganda to find work and got kicked out by Idi Amin in the 70s. And when he went to London, I guess for some reason, the Perry Mason books were popular. So Perry Mason hardcovers were in my house growing up. And so like I decided to read every single Perry Mason book. But anyway, I watched both seasons of that series and it was exquisitely well done. And the thing you said about lighting, Robert, comes to mind for that.
Yeah. By the way, the last Ishiguro book I read was Clara and the Sun, which I have read. He intended as a children's book. And his daughter told him that he was going to really mess up young children if this was a children's book.
Those are the best children's books, though, honestly.
The ones that are for adults?
Not even for adults, that are just like so dark, kind of messed up. You need children to have like a little bit of backbone.
I think some of the children's stories that are really meant for adults are like one of my favorite genre. And one that comes to mind is Haroun and the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. One of my all-time favorite books. Yeah. Have you guys all read it? Sounds like you have, Steph.
Yeah, it wasn't just Haroun. He wrote a couple of those. It's like Luca and the Fire of...
That's right. The Fire of Life.
Fire of Life. And I felt like some of his stories that were actually like sort of meant for children were some of his best writing. They're so magical and beautiful. I love them.
I agree. I have not read Luca and the Fire of Life, but I highly recommend everyone read Haroun and the Sea of Stories because it's kind of relevant to our work, actually. It's like about storytelling, which I hate that word because marketers use it in a very cheesy way, but it's about stories as streams. And if you think about the world we live in with like Twitter feeds and narratives coming out from everywhere, it's like waves of stories coming together and like threads tying, and it's just very magical. For sure, Midnight's Children was extraordinarily magical. I remember reading it on a train, and when I reached the halfway point, and I don't know if it's okay to give a spoiler after 25 plus years, it should be, but there is a magical moment in the middle of the book where the narrator, their family history is switched on you, and it's really surprising.
There's also The Enchantress of Florence was one that I forgot about.
Oh, that was like a kid's book by him?
I don't know if it was meant to be a kid's book, but it was another one of those sort of like lighter, that felt kind of like a fairy tale almost in the way that it was told.
I don't know how this meets with your children's book should be dark so they grow a spine. Steph. If
I
these
don't
are
want to be
all
quoted for that.
light and beautiful. I mean, you're like, yeah, they should have to like marinate in Grimm's fairy tales because those things are twisted.
I mean, the originals are dark.
They are super dark.
It's the OG.
It was dark. I mean, more like light and sort of narrative style. It's not this sort of like overwrought language. It's easy to read. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
But I do recall it being pretty dark still.
What would you guys have on you don't have to list them, but if you had to like just off the top of your head, think of a book that would make that top 10 of all time. Midnight's Children, I would put in my top 10 of all time ever books read in my life, for sure.
That's huge.
I don't know. I don't really do top 10 lists of movies or books or anything. I feel like I don't want to limit myself.
Yeah. I haven't listed it anywhere, but like just off the top of my head, like To Kill a Mockingbird would be on that list.
Yeah, I mean, that's classic.
I think one of my favorite books is actually one that I'm thinking about revisiting now, and it is The Endurance by Alfred Lansing.
So
yeah,
good.
It's about Shackleton's voyage.
Yes.
And when I'm having a hard day, I'm like, well, at least I didn't have to travel 800 miles or whatever in an open boat.
Yep.
Yeah. They called it his last ship in the headlines. It was a ship that he like died on called Quest, not even The Quest, A Quest. And they found that recently, I think, off the shore of Canada or something. But I think it's a good reason to visit The Endurance.
I didn't realize that was one of your favorites. By the way, it is on our list, speaking of reading lists, our CSX reading list, or was it Founder Summit? But one of our events, we made that as one of the books on the list. We added it as a book for inspiration for company builders.
It's phenomenal. Yeah, definitely holds up. It's kind of a riveting story. I think people praise Shackleton for his leadership style, even though he seems to be like pretty unlucky in terms of boats. Like they're all sinking, he's dying on boats. So maybe not a good example in terms of how to like conduct yourself on a boat or like have a successful boat that doesn't sink. Probably not the best, but I think people look to his leadership style because he kind of got through this, rallied everybody without losing any people that were on the ship, including one who had to have a leg amputated.
Who was the stowaway, by the way? Who they
Yes.
just like discovered on board midway across the Atlantic.
So you've read this too, Robert?
Oh God, yeah. This is definitely an all-time favorite for me.
Yeah.
And by the way, one of like my absolute favorite pieces of wisdom from Shackleton's leadership style is like the way he picked people to be on his crew. He would meet with somebody who applied to be like the ship's meteorologist, and like the person has no background in meteorology, but they can sing well and they have a funny nose. And so for Shackleton, like that was it. You just needed the esprit de corps above anything else.
Yeah.
And if he got along with you, he was like, you're in. Now, of course, they were shipwrecked for a very long time. I don't know if that's the best way to pick people, but like it's a strategy and one that I find entertaining.
I don't remember what his life was like leading up to the Endurance. There was some sort of like failure, misadventure there, but I forget what it was. Do you remember?
Yes, he had gone on an expedition and he got within spitting distance of the South Pole. And then they could have forged on and like people would have died. But instead of doing that, instead of like claiming the title and, you know, being world famous or whatever, they decided that they were going to do right by their people and turn back. So it was sort of his white whale. He's like, I've got to do this again. And, you know, Captain Ahab like intensity going on there.
Moby Dickian. I'm going to add that to my list now. I've kind of resisted it because I thought it was one of those cheesy books that people always recommend. I was just like, oh gosh, is this going to be like another one of those inspirational stories? You just like, how many times can you read that story? But you guys are making me want to read it.
I was reading the wiki page for the book after having read it. And like the last line, it was like that the guy, Alfred Lansing, wrote it in my hometown, which I thought was such a random fact.
Your
on the
hometown.
Wikipedia page. Yeah.
That is random.
Yeah, like this small little place in Long Island. My town is a square mile.
Speaking of New England, yeah, that was on my top 10. But speaking of New England nautical history, there is also a very popular book that also became a movie, but it's about the Essex, which is the boat that Moby Dick was based on. And that one is pretty unputdownable. It feels very like poppy and light in the heart of the sea. Nathan Philbrick.
Wow. I did not know you guys were into this nautical genre, but so interesting.
Some of them, it's not about the boats. It's more about like the adventure aspect. And I haven't actually read this book. I don't know if anyone on the call is, but nautical history kind of made our reading list too in The Wager by David Grann.
Oh, people love that book.
I've heard it was very good.
David Grann, the author of The Wager, he's probably the best adventure writer, I'd say, nonfiction adventure writer today.
Didn't he write Killers of the Flower Moon?
He did, which was just made into a movie with Leo and Martin Scorsese.
Some say it was a good film.
Allegedly so. I haven't seen it. David Grann, by the way, to tie it back to Endurance, wrote a great piece for The New Yorker. It's about a guy who is retracing the steps of an Antarctic explorer. He makes reference to Shackleton in it. It's a very short novella that they made out of the feature article, but it's just stunningly good. Like everything he writes is great. Lost City of Z.
I've been wanting to ask you, Robert, kind of a turn here, but just in terms of very popular books or books of all time. Last year when we had dinner with our publisher for Read Write Own with Chris and our agent and us, Chris asked you at the table, like, what's one of the best books you've read in a while? And you said Benjamin Le Batut's, I don't know if I pronounced it the right way, When We Cease to Understand the World. And I just want to know from you, like, why was that book so interesting? Because it seems like it's sort of in the zeitgeist. I mean, whatever that zeitgeist is defined to be, but like, why? What is it about that book?
Yeah, I'm totally obsessed with this book. I'm just sort of like addicted to reading nonfiction. Like, I feel like there's knowledge out there that should be in here in my head. And so I ravenously devour nonfiction as much as possible. And so when people asked me what my favorite book was, honestly, all of the nonfiction books I had read in the past year, I was like, I wouldn't recommend them. I just wanted to know more about whatever topic it was about. And the thing that really stood out was La Batut's slim volume, When We Cease to Understand the World, which is just all of these vignettes, these stories about tortured genius scientists from like the early 20th century, you know, like Werner Heisenberg and Alexander Grothendieck, the mathematician. And he dramatizes their story and he explains their insights, their sort of eureka moments, but explains like who they were as people and what they were going through. And I think it's just absolutely incredible, poetic, emotionally moving writing. And something I said that night, that this is like a really underexplored genre, sort of nonfiction, but inflected with fiction. Like, it's not true, but most of it's true. Like Kurt Vonnegut has this famous quote, which is, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, journalism is noise, fiction is melody, something of that nature. And when you do break the bounds a little bit and you're explicit about it, I think you can really deliver just a tremendously like moving piece of writing.
I honestly think that's actually true of all nonfiction, frankly, because I think nonfiction is fiction. But I think you're saying maybe if people give themselves more permission to play with that and stop pretending, which they kind of already are, to be blunt, maybe we could see more interesting works. Because I was going to say, I don't think that genre is underexplored. It feels like we see a lot of stories about tortured geniuses and their psychology. So when you said that, I was like, huh, really?
I think it's the way he plays with, he starts off, like, I read it after Robert's recommendation, and it starts
I got
with,
a lot of converts on this one.
You did. You got Chris, you got Tim, me soon. Yeah, keep going.
the first story he tells is he cleaves very close to the truth. He said he changes one detail in the story. But by the end of the book, he's just making stuff up about the inner life of, I think he ends with Schrodinger.
Yeah.
And he is making up what is happening or imagining what he's going through. And he does it very artfully over the course of the book with the different scientists. So you feel like you're getting, there's some scientific truth that you're getting there. And then by the end of it, though, he's really slipping into the fantastic or into the imaginative in a way that I don't think you see that often. I do agree that all nonfiction is lies. It's constructed choice.
Yes, exactly.
It's what you choose to leave out. You're trying to tell a coherent story, and coherent stories don't exist except in our imaginations. So
there are
Exactly.
rules. There are rules.
I don't know, Robert. It's like Tim said, you're picking some thing. Even the experts you pick to quote, like, yes, there may be some rules, but I almost feel like people should just ditch the conceit altogether.
Let's just make shit up.
I'm not saying make shit up, but let's just be honest about what's really happening.
Yeah, you can have a bibliography. Like, let's not be crazy.
Yeah, I guess you can have the sources, but even the way people select what to include and exclude in that is an art of editing, right? Like, you're always making choices.
I was just going to say, as a former journalist, this kind of goes to something that's always bugged me, which is this sort of like belief that you can have this view from nowhere, this sort of like objective stance.
Yeah.
And not to the exclusion of anything else, but I think it's valuable to have people who have skin in the game who are presenting evidence in favor of whatever position they have.
Oh, this is very much my point of view and thesis on media. This is why I believe in op-eds. And instead of having third-party voices, you should have a first-party voice, but have them rigorously edited so you hold them to a bar or run other viewpoints alongside. But I very strongly agree with this. Skin in the game is a more honest incentive. It was interesting what you said about a lot of the nonfiction books you read for information, so you wouldn't really recommend them. And it's actually funny because I think that's how a lot of people listen to podcasts these days. Like, the info density of insights is what you get out of. So for me, I have the exact opposite, which is, why would I read a book for information when I can just fast forward through something else, read an article, read a primary source article, hear something. I actually have completely almost stopped picking up nonfiction books for this reason. Like, I don't find them to be information dense enough. In fact, what you said about Benjamin Laboutut's book is more interesting, which is info-entertainment. Like, you're getting information about these scientists and entertainment. And that to me is a much more interesting genre.
Oh, I still go to nonfiction books because that's how I was trained to gather information. You learn in grad school to break books. Like, if I need to read something for information, I'm not like reading every word carefully. I might start with the index, the bibliography, read the intro, read the conclusion, and then blast through the rest of it so I can get the main point of what they're talking about. But that's just like, there's nothing pleasurable about that. That's just like searching for information.
Well, it's actually what Chris said at the offsite when we had that session on people sharing their techniques and mental models for learning, to just pick the chapters that are interesting you and skip everything else. Like, that's a perfectly fine way to read a book. You don't have to read it linearly. I mean, that's kind of what you're describing to some extent. It's a different kind of breaking the book. It's not methodical, but it is following your interestingness.
I have sort of an adaptation of Chris's method, which is, I still really can't break away from the linear trajectory of a book. But like 90% of my book consumption now is in audiobook form. And what I'll do is I will set the speed really high.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I get into something that's interesting, okay, let's slow it down a bit or rewind a bit and re-listen, at a slower pace. And I'll do that for a lot of books now. And it helps me tear through a lot. I don't know how much I'm retaining or absorbing, but that's my strategy.
I'm so glad you brought up audiobooks. So who of us is reading audiobooks these days? And by the way, do you guys even agree with the phrase? Some people argue that you should not say reading audiobooks. You should say listening. And to me, I am finding I am reading audiobooks. But anyway, are any of you guys listening to audiobooks? Any favorites or any thoughts on the medium?
I read audiobooks, let's be clear. I feel strongly about this.
I too read audiobooks. Here's my thoughts on audiobooks. And you mentioned this before, like I am a parent of a small child. So I took like a little bit of a break from reading because it didn't really feel like it fit into my life. And I didn't know like how, if I'm holding a baby, like how do I hold a book and how do I read in this way? And I felt like the best way for me to get back into reading that was most effective was like having it on multiple media. So especially if I'm really invested in a book, like I'll have 3 copies of it, one on audiobook, one on my phone, and then one in a hard copy, depending on my mood. You just have to like really fit it around your life.
So you're a multimodal reader on one book.
I do, because you got to fit it into your life and you have to be realistic about that.
Steph, what is the last book you read on the multimodal way? Like, what was the last book that was so tremendous you had to read it in 3 different ways?
It's like there's a combination, right? So 1 is I really like it, and 2 is I want to read it really fast. So 1, I really liked it, Babel, which is also on our reading list.
Oh yeah, my wife, she read that a few months ago.
2, I have to read it fast, which is Everything I Never Told You, and only because I'm reading it for a book club and I had a deadline. So I had to like really just jam it in.
What's Babel about?
Babel is sort of like students attending a magical academy. It's really hard to boil down, but it did have a lot of elements of sort of like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, in that it was sort of like dense and academic-y in places.
Dark academia, right? I think that's the genre.
Is it translation too? Is it about translation?
It's about translation and the magic of... It was an incredible book. I love fantasy, and I specifically love fantasy that has like a little bit of historical fiction in it. There's like magical realism, fun historical facts. I don't know. So I definitely recommend Babel, and I consumed it in many different ways.
That is amazing. And I love what you said about fitting it around your life and finding a way of doing that, because it's actually a luxury of our lifetime, as in this age we live in. I don't want to be all lofty about it, but it truly is remarkable. When you think about the history of books, at one point, books were not accessible to everybody until the advent of the printing press. And then that changed what was written, and things were shared and created new genres. And now you're talking about reading books in like 3 different modes because it's a way you're trying to fit it into your life. Like, that's freaking incredible.
Right. If I'm waiting for my daughter to fall asleep, I'll just pop in my headphones.
Yep.
Yeah. You got to be flexible.
Yeah. A lot of people talk about, I mean, this is such an obvious point, but we have to make it because it is such an important point to acknowledge, that the advent of AirPods was massive for accelerating adoption of both audiobooks and podcasts. You can just pop in earphones without being wired to something, and you can move around freely and be hands-free. And I just don't think we can underestimate that. So it's worth quickly acknowledging that technology played a key role in this acceleration too.
That's a great point. The one thing I dislike about it is like a favorite pastime is judging people based on what they're reading, or like, being like, oh, you're reading that? That's so cool. And you just don't get that with audiobooks. You don't know what people are doing.
I used to do that with guys I dated. Like, you go to their place, you see their shelf, and you're like, nope, this is not going to make the second date.
What was the book that made you do that? What was the book that was like, no way, second date?
Oh my God, I can't believe you're asking me that.
That's great.
I have one in mind.
Question.
I have one too. So mine was Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, that's bad.
Oh my God.
Really? Like, fine, read it, pulp it, give it away. But like, it should not be your favorite book in the pride of place of like, that's the best book I ever read. That's so funny you asked that. No one has ever asked me that question. What's yours?
It's Catcher in the Rye.
Ooh, spicy.
Is it because you don't want to date someone who has, I call this Holden Caulfield wannabe complex,
yes.
HCW complex? Yes. Yeah, you don't want to date a Holden Caulfield wannabe.
No.
I literally have my high school copy of Catcher in the Rye right back there on the top of my bookshelf.
And that's why, Stefan, you are incompatible.
Yeah.
We're kicking you off this.
Now I know why.
We can't talk to you anymore.
It's funny because Catcher in the Rye has like very sentimental value to me. My dad gave me a copy of Catcher in the Rye when I was 10 years old, which is too young to read Catcher in the Rye. I have like a little note from him in it. It's a hard copy. So like I have it on my bookshelf. I wouldn't date me for sure.
Okay, that's different though.
I also say that as I'm getting older, I am starting to like withhold judgment over people's reading choices a lot more because I feel like there should be something in your life, and I feel very strongly about this, is that something should be like a little treat, whatever you like, whatever interests you want to follow. I feel like that's fine. Whatever you're reading is fine. Have some pleasure in your life.
You were so right. And it's funny because I was going to tease Robert for being judgmental, but then I heard myself judging on both the example that you asked me about Da Vinci Code and then now Catcher in the Rye. So I held back. But I'm really glad you said what you just said.
It's contradictory. Like, I think the instinct is still there for sure, but I'm trying to train myself out of it.
And we all do have guilty pleasures that you would never admit to people. Like, what are your guys's? Come on, embarrass yourself on air.
We have guilty pleasures we would never admit to people. So talk about them on this podcast. Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Let me tell you about this for work.
I'll just go on the record and say that I'm embarrassed to admit that I whipped through the Da Vinci Code and multiple sequels, like at the time that they came out.
They are page turners.
I read it too.
I myself am deeply involved in the Sarah J. Maas universe. I don't even think that's a guilty pleasure. It's just fun. Have some enjoyment. Just like strike guilty from it.
Yeah, I've been very much a fanatic about Sarah J. Maas. And going back to the topic of the reading list, if you go back like 7 years, people will see her books show up. And I feel very proud of that because at that time, she was not a New York Times bestselling author. Right now, she's been dominating the New York Times bestselling list for a very long time. But a lot of her early books, people could not get through because they're a bit of a slog to get into the world building and the universe she builds. So it took a lot of like fanatic fandom, word of mouth, and fans over time saying, no, you have to do. I did this with a lot of our friends here at A6&Z that I also were converts after I was like, no, just get through book 1 of this series and you will like it and love it. And so to me, she has that magic. She also, by the way, because I had never heard this word until the publisher dinner, December, is like an icon of the romantasy genre.
Oh, yeah.
Like romantic fantasy, which that term is new. Like that was kind of remarkable to me because I've always read romantasy books. I did not know that was a genre, but I think that's a great guilty pleasure. That's a pleasure to be proud of.
I feel like it's exploded, this genre. There's so many more options. It's great.
Yeah, but I wonder if it's a sign of something bigger. Like you have to wonder if the popularity of fantasy is not only happening because of cultural craving for religion and like people don't have like a certain mythology anymore in their lives, like you might get from religion, a craving because of increased loneliness, a craving for connection, more world building. I mean, I hate to make it all serious, but one does have to wonder why this is happening now. I don't know if you guys have any theories.
So we just had our offsite in London. We all were just there. We had our startup accelerator in London. And so the team all went over there. And in anticipation of this, I started rereading Lord of the Rings.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm like knee deep in Tolkien right now. And, the thing that drove him was he was upset that his home, the UK, that the myths that were developed after the Angles and the Saxon Germanic tribes invaded England, they had a good stretch of hundreds of years there. But then the Normans invaded in like the year 1000 and basically wiped out the local culture. And that oral tradition of myth didn't survive. And so what he wanted to do was basically think, what would that have been? What would those myths have been? And he wanted to resurrect that. And so his like language building was this exploration of there's this, God-shaped hole here of a lack of Anglo-Saxon myth, and I'm going to fill it.
I had no idea that was the origin of those books.
And I could bring something up back from the start of this conversation, Grimm's fairy tales. And fun fact, because I was looking into all this, but apparently Grimm was a famous linguist and he developed a law about like how language changes over time. And this deeply impacted Tolkien and made him become a linguist and philologist and whatever.
I mean, he invented his own language.
Yes, based on Grimm's law. This was like the awakening thing for him that made him kind of discover his life's work.
That's wow.
Anyway, I'm like deep in Tolkien right now. So yeah.
Are you actually enjoying it though? For real?
So deeply. Like, okay, like here's the thing about it. And this is like another aspect of him trying to recreate Anglo-Saxon myth is the language is all derived from Anglo-Saxon. And Anglo-Saxon is a very vigorous, simple tongue. Whereas like French and Latin are very complicated and intricate. What are some good examples of, like going on a trip versus a voyage? It's all very like simple words. And so it's so easy to digest. And it's very fairy tale like.
Did you read it as a kid, by the way? Because you're rereading this now, right?
Oh, God. Yeah. I mean, hardcore. My 5th grade teacher called me Bobbit. So that's.
I've read Tolkien, I think probably literally dozens of times since I was a kid.
Same. I was surprised on my reread of The Hobbit that there were so many songs. It's like a lot
many songs.
of songs.
They're not great songs either.
They're just okay songs.
They're okay.
But I went to a record store in Seattle recently with my husband where we found like a collection of Tolkien reading the poems. He didn't perform the songs. They hired people to do that. But the record came out in like the 60s and it is really wonderful. We actually like use it as a soundtrack for this game we're playing called The One Ring. It is the Lord of the Rings RPG that I actually recommended on our last reading list.
Yeah, because last time we included games too.
Yeah, we included games last time. I did recommend this RPG. It is very fun. There are some limitations, like the lore master, who is our kind of dungeon master, won't let us use dynamite, which I feel is unfair because there were fireworks. But it is overall a really fun way to like engage with Lord of the Rings in a new format.
I was wondering about that because like, at Bilbo's birthday party, they shoot off all these crazy fireworks. And I'm like, why do these not appear later when they're like, slaughtering each other in the death fields?
Yeah, is Gandalf like gatekeeping these fireworks just for fun? Like,
I think he might be.
Damn that Gandalf and his gatekeeping ways.
Also, just why, if you know the person who was celebrating their birthday was traumatized by a dragon earlier in their life, would you launch a dragon firework over the tent at his birthday party when he's old and could have a heart attack and die?
The thing I love about Gandalf is he's exactly that kind of person in the books. But in the movies, they make him gentler. But he's like kind of a saucy man in the books.
He was still kind of hard in the movies. I mean, run, you fools. The reason I asked you guys, so first of all, I did not realize that all of you guys were super Tolkienites. So I love the Lord of the Rings universe. And as a child, I did read the Tolkien books, but I tried rereading them after the movies came out as an adult, and I could not get into them. And I would go so far as to put them in my list of that rare case where movies are better than books.
Ooh.
And so for me, Lord of the Rings is in that genre. And I want to know from you guys, before everyone attacks me for that, I'm going to like deflect this for a minute. You guys have any other books that fit into that category where the movie was better than the book or the TV show was better than the book?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I love this question.
I mean, I guess Perry Mason I would have to add to this list too, because that show was phenomenal compared to the books.
People have told me otherwise, and I have no basis to say this because I didn't read the books. Obviously, everybody watched Game of Thrones. And if you didn't, where were you? But I had so many friends who were like, you have to read the books. The books are so good. And I was like, I am not devoting that much of my life to something.
No.
Like the show is so good. There's no way that it's like 10x better than the show.
The books were great before the show came out. And then for those of us who were like waiting for these books to come, like some of us waited years, he kind of does this thing with the second to last book that he published, that thing that fantasy authors do when you're waiting for a book, which I hate. Sarah Moss did this, by the way, too, in the original Throne of Glass series, where they give you the other version of a set of characters while you're waiting for the main characters. And it's like, not only are you freaking waiting to give me the book I want, you're now telling me the other stories I don't care about. And even though, yes, you're really good at it and it is compelling, I'm still angry at you. And so I kind of agree with you. I think in the end, I would go for the movies over the books on that one too.
Same. I didn't love the show The Witcher, and I didn't love the books The Witcher, although I know people are very passionate about them, but I found them very difficult to read. But I love the game The Witcher.
Yeah.
So that's another one of those situations where like it translates better to certain media than others.
By the way, I have not played the game The Last of Us, but people argue that the show of that is as good or on par with the game, because the game, they say, is more intense and that the show has like more of a nice human feel-good element to it for Last of Us. I don't know if you play the game or watch the show.
This is an extremely controversial topic and I won't comment.
Oh, I didn't realize.
It's heated.
Yeah. Do you have any books, Tim, that are better than the movies are better than? You're such a book person. I feel like you feel like it would be sacrilegious to admit this, but there has to be something where
No, I'd admit it. I also don't have any guilty pleasures. I'm not guilty about anything.
You just own your pleasures.
Absolutely. They're mine. I own them.
No, he's just busy reading the intros and conclusions of books and moving on.
Bibliographies all day.
That's me. I was trying to think of books where I think the movie is better or TV is better. I will keep thinking. The Expanse.
On our team, Aaron loves that TV show. The Expanse.
Yeah,
he keeps recommending it.
He is such a sci-fi buff.
He is. You know who else is a sci-fi buff? Is Kate, our compliance officer.
You know, when you deal in compliance all day long, you got to have a little escapism. I think that's the bottom line.
Fun thing about our offsites is finding out like the sci-fi club. I mean, Aaron told me about Kate. Once I found out about Kate, I connected Brittany to Kate so that they could talk. I was like, you two should talk to each other.
She reads so much.
And her Instagram is literally all like her giving a score, like 1 out of 10 on every book she reads. And I got really annoyed at her once because I'm like, why'd you say that book was like higher score when you told me you didn't like it? You're giving yourself like ratings inflation. Like, what are you doing?
They are inflated. I have never seen her rate anything under a 7, but I think that's awesome. Like, just like, I loved it. I loved it all.
Well, I was just like, Brittany, you said you didn't like it that much. And she actually gave a very good answer, which was, you know, it wasn't for me, but it was the kind of book that I thought others would actually read. And I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, it wasn't so bad that you wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
It's like Uber stars. Like, your Uber ranking is between 4.8 and 5. That's the scale.
That's a real thing that actually happens. Yeah. You know, one thing I'll say, so we started publishing these What We're Reading book lists years ago. And it was because we are such a reading culture. And we talk about that a lot. And it's interesting because people are always wanting to know what Mark Andreessen's reading. People write up articles based on it when he tweet storms it. You know, Ben has a point of view, like, I won't, you know, read any business books except he wrote really good ones that are not like other business books. And then you have like the one business book he recommends to everybody, which is Andy Grove's books.
High Output Management.
Yep, exactly. And there is like this culture. What I find fascinating, having, you know, seen and produced these lists for years, is which books keep coming back over and over and over again. And I'm trying to think of the ones that keep showing up. Do you remember? Because we always put it in the intro, like which ones are kind of always coming up.
I've seen Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow repeat itself across a couple lists.
Yep. That was very much at the zeitgeist, you know, a couple of years ago.
By the way, I have an unpopular opinion on that, which is I tried to read it, read a few chapters, and I just could not get into it.
Interesting.
I considered myself like a gamer if I had to pick a subculture to identify with as like a kid. I was probably a gamer. But I found the references just to be so over the top. I was like, like you're laying it on way too thick.
Yeah, I haven't been able to read it either, and I don't know why. I'm going to try it again.
I'm going to try it again too, because so many people have recommended it.
And different people keep recommending it. Is there anything else?
Well, on this list, one book that's come up a number of times is Unreasonable Hospitality.
Yeah, what is that? I have never heard of it.
I thought it was going to be a Danny Meyer book, but it's by the guy who founded the restaurant group that has the Nomad and 11 Madison Park restaurant groups. And I think it's about how to be unreasonably hospitable, if I had to guess from having read the copy, but I have not read the book.
Yeah, Will Guidara. I don't know if I'm saying that
sounds right.
But
yeah.
You're just like frothing at the mouth while holding a bunch of plates in your hand, serving food so fast. I can see it.
Sold much better than his other book, Unreasonable Hostility.
Wait, is that real or you're joking? Okay, good. I'm like, wait, is that actually a book?
One more book or collection of books that has frequently appeared is Emily St. John Mandel. She's written a number of books, and she seems to be a perennial on these lists.
I think I've been one of the people that's recommended her a lot.
You did, yeah.
Station 11, I think you recommended.
Yeah, but I think I've kind of gone back on that because now I feel like...
Anti-recommendation?
Yeah, I'm kind of take it back. I mean, look, this is a case where the show was better than the book.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, we've got one.
And Patrick Somerville was the showrunner and it was excellent. And that's why I went and read the books. I also saw that first. So maybe that influenced that. I read Glass Hotel and then I read her last book that is like the transition world building across the two books.
Sea of Tranquility.
Sea of Tranquility. Yes, exactly.
And then The Glass Hotel is the other one.
Yes, that came before. And I think actually now it's funny this happened, but it's in a weird way. I wrote about this in the last list that I loved The Sea of Tranquility. Now, having had some distance from it, I think I found that to be too contrived. And now it's made me feel irritated at the previous books. So I'm retracting those recommendations.
Wow, what an arc you've been on.
Yeah, I know. Very, very crazy. Her work is wonderful in general, but I think I've moved past it personally.
Like the protagonist in a good novel, you can evolve and totally change.
I guess that's true.
She has these weird things that she's like obsessed with. Like, have you noticed all of her characters are into shipping? What's up with that? Like, does she like the shipping industry? There's always a lot about the shipping industry in all of her books.
Tell us more about why one would like the shipping industry, Sonal.
Well, I am obsessed with container ships and shipping, but you guys are the ones that read the most on the shipping industry. So you guys should tell us more. You're the one who picked all those books on shipping and ocean faring and navigation.
Which, to bring it back, the origins of venture capital is the whaling industry. So
that's right.
It's not totally tangential.
Yeah, the word carry apparently came from how much you could carry like the portion of the whale because you were participating. Apparently, that's the folklore behind that term.
Shipping is fascinating. So if Emily St. John Mandel wants to incorporate it, who's to blame her?
I enjoyed Station 11. I do think that some of the preoccupations really come through. Station 11 had a lot of stuff about Shakespeare in it. And one of the themes that I thought was actually really interesting that kind of came out of that one for me was like, and this might be a total tangent, but what does like literature about pandemics look like after the pandemic? And I think it's interesting that she already like kind of brought in Shakespeare because a lot of Shakespeare's plays, like obviously the plague, various plagues were like a big part of life at the time and something that they had to live with. Like theaters were closed because of them. It was like something that everybody had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, like we had to deal with COVID. But it doesn't really appear explicitly in any of the plays. Like nobody wants to read about a pandemic while a pandemic is happening. So what does literature about pandemics look like now? That was like a fun thing to think about.
Was it written before COVID?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Years before, like 3-4 years before at least, I think.
What's she writing about now? I need a heads up on what's coming.
Yeah. What is the next disaster? She's like, it's a meteor.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you brought that up, Steph, because one of the things that stood out about the show and the book, but especially in the show, was what art forms endure after a disaster. Mm-hmm. And it is super interesting that Shakespeare is the one thing that endures and that gives people hope in the darkness. Like there is something really special about that.
Okay, so one conspiracy theory I recently indulged was the, Shakespeare didn't author his own works conspiracy.
Oh, yeah.
It's not true.
Well, come on. It's fun, though.
Okay.
And,
we'll humor you.
Yeah. So I was a huge Shakespeare buff and have acted in a lot of Shakespearean plays. I like him. I like his work. Think it's good.
Bold position, Robert.
Yeah, right? Can you believe it?
I like Shakespeare, too.
But
contrarian.
I was getting into Fernando Pessoa, who is like the Portuguese James Joyce. Basically, he's like their leading modernist literary light. And he was obsessed with this theory that, Shakespeare was a fabricated identity assumed by other people. He was like deep, deep, deep in this. And so anyway, that's how I fell down that rabbit hole.
Why do you think that people care so much?
Okay. So I think it comes down to like one aspect of this is that it comes down to, could somebody with such a not high status background that he could pen such influential works and be who he was, be Shakespeare? Could you have that intellectual heft and weight and all that if you come from a lower background? And, so it's a class thing. But then, what's fun about the conspiracy theories is it devolves into all this sort of like puzzle solving, riddle solving, chasing down details. And I like crossword puzzles. I like puzzles. They're fun.
You like Dan Brown.
I read Digital Fortress. Like that's how much I was into Dan Brown. I'm ashamed to admit that.
Don't be ashamed.
On the Shakespeare thing, I find it really fascinating because nobody questions a musical genius that comes from a less educated, less higher socioeconomic background. And yet they do when it comes to a literary person, as if writing can only be in the hands of a few when it's like a universal skill in many ways. Obviously, literacy is not universal, but like the ability to speak, articulate, share a story can be. So I find that really interesting.
I love that analogy. I think that's exactly right.
And I wonder about that. And the other thing that I find really interesting, this is connected to crypto, is this idea that when there's an anonymous person or a pseudonymous person, it's almost always defaulted that the identity may not be one person, but a collective. Like Satoshi Nakamoto And Shakespeare was not really one person, but a collective. Like one of the most popular genres and writers for adolescents and tweens is Rick Riordan and the Percy Jackson series. And every kid I know who's a teenager and below loves and reads those. And that's not only him. There are ghostwriters that help build that universe. So it's not unheard of that can happen. So I don't know. Like, I wonder, like, what is it? Like that, as if like genius can't really come from one person, or I just find it so fascinating.
Well, specifically, I mean, I think there's like a certain amount of co-writing that happens with plays, specifically with Shakespeare's plays, because, authors have certain copies of their own lines. Some things are changed while it happens. Like there is an amount where it's like not just him, and it is sort of like a collaboration as well. And I wonder if that kind of opened up the doors to this too. But I know there's probably a bunch of people looking into it or who have looked into it.
Well, it's funny you of all people say that, having worked at GitHub, because what you're basically describing is like a commit, like submitting it back in, like it's like kind of a GitHub for plays. Like it's true. Authors take a fork that they might mark up their own copy. They put it back into the canonical, like check it back in. Someone else makes a modification. And it's like, these things are meant to be living systems. You almost wonder what writing plays would have been like in the age of GitHub or such.
Yeah, I mean, folks have used GitHub to try out a variety of use cases for like writing documents and that kind of stuff and doing more collaborative work that's not necessarily revolving on code. Seen everything from like legal documents to recipes and all kinds of stuff. But with Shakespeare specifically, like I think, we have this sort of canonical first folio. That's what we look to as like what the plays are. It's sort of our source. I don't completely know like how they were collected. Like, was somebody transcribing the play? Was there like one version of it that was written based on all of like everybody's text? Like they weren't meant to be read, they were meant to be performed. So it's difficult to tell.
Stephen Greenblatt has written
Stephen Greenblatt for sure knows,
lots of books about this.
It is funny when you shift mediums, like Shakespeare, to Steph's point, was meant to be performed and acted. And yet we often teach it in the classroom as like, go home and read this play. And it's like, I don't understand what they're saying. Like the language is weird. It all sounds like my voice in my head. And it's unfortunate that that's the way it gets taught.
Yeah, you miss the jokes. There's so much that comes out in the performance.
Yeah, it's like written in iambic pentameter, so a lot of the lines and delivery depend on this rhythm. And if you hear it out of rhythm, it's a little bit harder to understand, I think. Once you have like body language and intonations and like the dynamicism of someone like speaking on stage, I think it's so much easier to figure out what's happening, even though, this language can be super incomprehensible.
It's actually amazing too how it is so lyrical that you can remember it if you memorize any passages. Like I think I must have memorized this passage in high school. And I still remember the out, life is but a poor player, walking and strutting his hour upon the stage. Is either Hamlet or Macbeth. That's what I remember, but I don't remember which one.
Oh, it is Macbeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, where tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow comes from, that other book, that's the monologue. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow until there is no more. Oh my God, it just came back to me. The next podcast will just be a reenactment of Macbeth.
from like our general memory of how it goes.
And then what happens?
I'll just be washing my hands a lot. That's all I remember from that play.
Speaking of, I recently found out that the leader of the Shakespeare troupe I was in college.
You were in a Shakespeare. Hold on, stop. We can't go to this point. You were in a Shakespeare.
Okay, I'm outing way too many things.
This is some really good Robert facts.
You can't just like skim over that part. But okay, finish your question.
Turns out she became the chief storyteller of Sleep No More, which is pretty cool. I just learned that like the other day.
Huh.
So that's kind of cool. Which is based on Macbeth. I will say just one more thing before we move on, which has been a common theme here, is I mentioned Pessoa, the Portuguese writer. And Sonal, you were talking about how in crypto, you have this like pseudonymous creator, which has this allure to it. One thing that's interesting about Pessoa was he went the opposite direction, which is he created what he called heteronyms. He had basically invented all of these different personalities and voices, kind of like Shakespeare did with all of his characters, but he played them out in like newspapers, and he would like have them write in editorials to newspapers. He invented like entire backstories for these people. He'd have them argue with each other.
I love that. And there is a crypto connection beyond Nakamoto and pseudonymous identity, because one of the most exciting and interesting things about NFTs is the ability to think about different identities Like you don't have to just have one person, like you can be many different people if you wanted to. And not in the negative sense of like a Sybil, but in the positive sense of like if you're in one gaming world, you could be one character. And if you're in another gaming world, you could also have another character associated with your overall parent identity, but you could play out multiple identities if you wanted, which I think is such an interesting thing in general.
Absolutely.
What else do we want to talk about? Back to audiobooks. So it's interesting because when I first started getting into audiobooks, I found them to be very boring and I would just tune out. Like what would happen is I would be in it and then I would just keep losing my spot in my head. And so I'd have to keep going back and I just finally gave up. And I was like, okay, maybe podcasts are more interesting to me because a conversation is happening. I don't know what's happened. In the last year, I suddenly am more addicted to audiobooks than any other genre, podcasts, written books, all of it. And I'm loving it. And I have one of these Amazon Prime premium memberships on Audible where you can pick a lot of books and you get the monthly credit, but you also get a lot of books that are available under premium where they hire actors to read classics. And the two that I loved in particular are Pride and Prejudice, read by Rosamund Pike. And she does every character as a voice. And for those of you who've seen the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice, which is frankly maybe even better than the book, this audiobook of it, read by Rosamund Pike, is phenomenal. Like you're immersed into this world of all these characters. And she does every voice with its own unique imprint, no other sound effects. So it's remarkable. I've also been doing this with Anna Karenina, where Maggie Gyllenhaal is a narrator. And now she does not do different voices. In fact, she uses the same two voices to do two characters and alternating dialogue. But her voice is so soothing and so interesting. And it just brings a subtle story to life. And Robert, I tried putting it on speed and you can't because it actually ruins the voice. You can't do Maggie Gyllenhaal's voice on fast forward. But what I'm finding with both of these audiobooks is there are books I've read. I mean, Anna Karenina I probably read in high school and didn't fully get. But hearing them and reading them by listening to them, I am paying far better attention to the language and the details than I ever would had I just read it. And I've read Pride and Prejudice a million times, but there's things I notice in the words that I would never have listened to. And I don't know if that's happening with you guys, but that's been very new and interesting to me and happening with audiobooks.
I completely agree. And you can hear the inflection differently as well. I think especially with books that were written, centuries ago, like when the language is slightly different, it's a little bit harder to just like come off the page in a way that somebody would say it. Having an actor read it can probably help you understand a lot more for sure. I've been reading and listening to. I've been having like a multimedia experience with this audiobook. Maybe that's what we call it. I've been reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it's narrated by Alan Cumming, and he's excellent, obviously.
He's such a good actor, too. Is it on Audible?
I'm reading it on Audible, listening to it on Audible.
I think there's something about 19th century literature in particular that a lot of it was written to be read aloud. That's a way that you shared with the people around you. That lends itself to listening rather than reading.
Gosh, that's a really good point. I forgot that that was the case. I mean, I was thinking of that being true for radio and like radio plays, but you're talking about just people sitting around at night without television. They would take turns reading to each other or together, which I think is a very beautiful thing that people only unfortunately do with their kids these days. But I think more adults, like couples, friends, groups of people should read out loud to each other. I think there's something very magical about that as well.
So my wife and I have been like, before we go to sleep, we've been making our way through E.H. Gombrich's The Story of Art. And we'll each read we'll alternate. Like I'll read 2 pages one night, she'll read 2 pages the next night. And then after that, we'll listen to an audiobook to fall asleep. That's sort of like our nightly regime.
That's really special. One thing I did want to mention in this vein is graphic novels. And one of the best graphic novels I read in the last year was Kristen Rodkey's book called CQ, A Journey Through American Loneliness. My friend Eugene recommended it to me, and it's one of the most interesting treatments of the topic, just as a combination of personal history and the way it brings together all these threads, and it's like distilled into one graphic novel.
I used to read a lot of graphic novels. I haven't dipped into that in a while. It's been a long time, but I want to check that one out. What's nice about it is that it is a medium that you cannot translate to, I mean, you could translate it to audiobook, but it would be a completely different thing.
You're so right. It can't be translated to audiobooks.
It is so inherent to the medium in which it's, created.
Robert, I've been dying to ask you, since you and I have actually not talked about this yet, but one of the first audiobooks I read that made me fall in love with audiobooks again, well, two of them. One was Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. It's just so phenomenally done and read out loud. And he does voices and personality in a very organic, natural way. But the other was Spare by Prince Harry. And I loved it. And I'm going to make my case for it because people make fun of me for loving that book so much.
I only read this book so that I would have conversation material with you, Sonal.
Because it's the only thing I would talk about for a long time. But you've never told me what you actually thought. Because did you read it or did you hear it?
I heard it.
Okay, good. Because his voice is
which
phenomenal.
I call reading.
Yes, and I agree.
Yeah.
I read the book that way too. And who is the name of the ghostwriter who helped him? He's really talented. I forgot his name.
Yeah, J.R. Moringer. He wrote The Tender Bar. That was sort of his like autobiography. He wrote Open, Andre Agassi's biography, and Shoe Dog with Phil Knight, the CEO and founder of Nike.
And by the way, Shoe Dog is a book that has come up nearly every year on our reading list since we started this franchise. It always comes up as the entrepreneurial book. It's always on the list. It's like probably the most Lindy of all the books on that list.
I will say I avoided that book for a long time because when I was at Fortune, business people would always say, "Oh, Shoe Dog, it's such a great book."
Yeah,
and I was like, if this business person is recommending a book to me, I am not going to read it.
Yeah, it's an anti-heuristic, exactly.
And I was dead wrong on that one. That book is really, really great. And reading it convinced me that I should read Spare, even though I have absolutely zero interest in the royal family. Sorry, apologies to the king, but...
Well, I found that book captivating, even if you're not interested in the royal family. So did you actually like it? Tell me truthfully.
Look, the writing is incredible. And the fact that I had zero interest in the subject matter, and honestly, kind of maybe slightly disdainful toward the subject matter going into it, and the fact that I made my way all the way through it, and I found it totally engaging and extremely well written and spoken, to Harry's credit.
Yeah, he's a natural. Our editor who edited Read, Write, Own was also, you edited Read, Write, Own, but our publisher editor, Ben Greenberg, he was the editor on that book.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. And he mentioned it at our dinner and I was like, oh, I didn't read it because I just thought it'd be like one of these gossipy books. But actually, when he recommended it over that dinner, I read it over break and I was hooked beyond belief. It was actually beautiful, heart-wrenching storytelling about family and family dynamics, regardless of who you are. You actually come away with more empathy for the king and Prince William than dismay. You feel like you understand everyone's points of view. You feel deep empathy for a person who hasn't chosen this life. And this idea that your whole purpose is service, like to serve communities and causes, like that was very beautiful and inspiring to me and frankly made me motivated. So for me, that was like a very beautiful outcome of the book. But I do want to make the case to others that I think this book is fascinating because one could argue that Spare is really about what happens when a startup bumps up against an old traditional industry. And I know this is going to seem a little overwrought and stretched, but go with me for a second.
Bring us there, Sonal.
Yes, I am making a case because I strongly believe that story, because so much of the conflict is about a traditional institution trying to preserve its values, which is a fair and good motive. You understand it. And then another group, i.e. Meghan and Harry, bring about certain change and their frustration with the way things are done and the clash that happens. And I'm very angry and bitter at how paparazzi can extractively, like that doesn't feel like media and investigation to me. That's like the worst kind of gossip. The other argument I'll make for listeners of the podcast, especially for this group of people that love the idea of, quote, going direct, i.e., cutting out media and just telling your story directly, it is kind of empowering and powerful that Harry can finally tell his story directly. Yes, it is intermediated through a publisher, but it is going direct. He's not going through the royal rotor to do this like dance that they've been doing for decades. So that's my argument. I think it's very much worth reading. I think it's completely phenomenal. And I could not put it down, i.e. stop listening to it. I think it's one of the best books I've read in a really long time, honest to God.
That's great.
Thanks for indulging me about it.
While reading it, I did have a gnawing sense of what's being left out. I do think it's very powerful to go direct. I just had this gnawing sense of, I wonder about the other perspectives here. That being said, like we were talking about earlier, I do appreciate somebody coming out with their view on something and being open about it and saying, this is where I stand.
I want the first draft of Spare.
That is the question, Steph.
Did you put it on the list?
I need to add it. One thing that you guys said earlier, you said that someone recommending made you not want to read it.
Yeah.
You were saying how everyone recommending like Shoe Dog on our reading list made you not want to read it. Do you guys have other kind of anti-heuristics like that for things you won't read? Like besides, it's on this guy you don't like dating bookshelf or whatever.
Oh, I trust everything on our reading list, by the way. I highly recommend what our people promote.
Yes, I would read everything.
It's those other business people who don't know what they're talking about.
Okay. Ours are the good kind, which I agree with, actually. They're not like those cheesy kind. Any anti-heuristics on your guys' like picking books that you will not read these books if so-and-so?
This isn't fair to our reading list, but I do not enjoy books about habit building and about biohacking. I feel like these books are mostly geared toward people who have, I don't want to say this in a derogatory way, but like pretty simple lives. So like people without kids, like people without different complexities in their lives that they have to manage.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you build habits when you're juggling literal chaos? It often doesn't apply to most people, I think.
You haven't read enough of these books.
Okay, maybe I am like simplifying, and I just recited the back cover of one of these.
That was Robert throwing a dagger at you, Steph,
No,
and trying to like literally throwing some fighting words your way.
If you read a few of these productivity books, all that chaos will dissipate and melt away. Your life will be just a glorious, easy ride from here on out.
So true. But yeah, in general, I feel like I've built some habits and not on purpose. Not deliberately, ever, probably. It's always been kind of like happy accidents when they're good habits. So I don't know how much this genre has helped me in this way.
Well, speaking of what Robert said about what the people want and the market pools, it's not an accident that Atomic Habits has been like at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for like ever.
Yes.
So one has to wonder what's going on there.
I read it. I liked it. I recommend it.
Have you formed any new habits as a result?
I just think like we're born into this world without anything. Like we have nothing to go on, no user manual. Like I don't know how this works up here, like in my head. What's going on in there? Who knows? Like that stuff's crazy. So yeah, to, I don't know, learn a little bit about how I'm just sort of this like behavioral machine that responds to pleasure and avoids punishment is interesting.
I don't know. I feel like I'm happiest when I'm on an absolute tangent. Like when I am on Wikipedia at 11:30 p.m. and I'm just starting something and I know it's going to take hours and I am Googling like what kind of foliage was on jewelry in the 19th century. Laurel, oak, acorns, lots of this kind of thing. And
Love that.
That is when I'm like following weird tendrils in my head, like going into rabbit holes late at night. And if someone will write a book about that, I'll read it.
Speaking of someone writing a book like that, have you ever seen the account Depths of Wikipedia?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh, you would love it. Yeah, because I think it's she surfaces all kinds of cool, weird articles. But what you're describing is actually going down a rabbit hole for something you were curious about that you're trying to just find out and then you chase it. And she's just finding random cool articles on Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think curiosity is magic.
I totally agree with that. Tim, do you have any anti-heuristics?
I tend to put off reading books that my wife recommends to me.
Ooh.
She better not be listening to this podcast.
Spicy.
Ouch.
What has she recommended?
Sorry, Wendy.
Everything she recommends, I end up reading it and it's really good, but it just goes to the bottom of my pile.
Let's just say you're dividing and conquering. You're like splitting up the book territory.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a really good way of putting it.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a great perspective. She's already read it. Why would I need to? And invariably, anything I recommend to her goes to the bottom of her pile. So there you go.
At least it's mutual.
Yeah, there are genres I don't read a lot of business books. I don't read a lot of self-help productivity books.
I actually think your idea of not reading Wendy's books is not the bad one. I mean, I'm not speaking about whether it's good or not for your marriage, but just as a book recommendation engine, collaborative filtering, which is the early model for recommendation systems, i.e. reading based on what your friends are reading, is like the worst model of reading recommendations because I do not care what my close friends are reading. I'm much more interested in what people who have shared interests are reading or whose curiosity is similar to mine are reading. So I actually think not picking things that people very close to you is a very good heuristic for picking. So I think that's very logical and rational, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. We've been married for almost 35 years, so I don't think it's damaged the longevity of the marriage. And I do eventually read them. And again, they're always good, so I don't know why I haven't, updated based on experience.
Robert, do you have an anti-heuristic?
I do have a heuristic, which is when I start getting the same recommendation, whether it's a TV show, a movie, or a book, from totally disparate, nodes in my social network, like people who have nothing in common with one another, at least I think have nothing in common, and they all start mentioning the same thing around the same time, then it vaults to the top of my list. I'm like, I got to check that out.
That's funny because that one actually annoys me when that happens. This will surprise no one. I hate when groups of smart people all start talking about the same thing. And I get very bored by that. Like, I get annoyed that so many smart people in tech all talk about the same books at the same time. I'm just like, please, I don't want to read the same thing as all of you. But I do agree with you that that's a good signal, by the way, objectively. It's just annoying to me when people are flocking together reading the same thing.
This is actually how I found Sarah J. Maas, though, where it was like suddenly everybody from all walks of life was like, have you read this? Have you read this?
Yeah.
And then all of the conversations we had like invariably devolve into these frantic conversations about these books.
Yeah.
Like that felt like a really good signal. It felt really energizing.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of Sarah Maas, are you reading Court of Thorn and Roses, Crescent City, Throne of Glass? What series are you reading?
I'm moving on to Throne of Glass now. I just finished all of the Court of Thorns and Roses.
Well, there's more books coming in Court of Thorn and Roses, obviously, but she does a cool intersection, actually, like a crossover world building between the end of Court of Thorn and Roses and Crescent City. But Throne of Glass is the one that I had to tell people you have to get through the first book to get the real energy, because by book 2, it like really picks up, and one of my all-time favorite characters of all literature shows up in book 2. So
nice.
You'll see it, and it's like so good. I don't have an anti-heuristic, but I will just say very simply that I don't read Oprah's book picks and Booker Prize winners. So I'm equally elitist and unelitist in that I will not also read Booker Prize winners. I find them very contrived. And I don't know, I find Oprah's book picks just nice, but not interesting enough. So one person whose picks I always trust, though, is Tyler Cohen. And anytime he puts a book pick, like fiction in particular, I will almost always pick up. And I never go wrong with his picks. Like he recommended Dominique Starnone's Ties to me, like the short novella that was so good. He's the one who convinced me to read Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet, which would definitely make the top 10 all time. But I thought it was just like books about female friendship, which that's a good reason, but that for me wasn't interesting enough. But it turns out to be like so interesting as a story, a backdrop against like fascist politics in Naples, Italy, and like a country coming of age. And it's so phenomenally well written and good and beautiful. I mean, Tim, you're rereading them, aren't you?
Yeah, Tim, didn't you recommend them on a recent book list, actually?
Yes, I have read, and I think it's also like, you could have no interest in female friendships. I do, but you could have no interest in the backdrop of fascist Italy, and it's just you want to keep turning the page to read the prose. In translation, no less. They're really just beautifully written.
Yeah. And I would say, because this is something that's very rare, but most books feel derivative. I feel like every book is a version of some book I've read before. I would say the 2 most non-derivative books I've ever read, and in the last decade, would be Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet. That's just so original and fresh. And also Cixin Liu, or Liu Cixin, The Three-Body Problem trilogy. Nothing about it feels derivative. All 3 books. God. Yeah. A lot of people stop at the first book, and I just want to make sure you have to read all 3 books to really get it.
All-time great. I am so happy that it is now a TV show, because I've been telling people to read that book series for so long, and now, like, I know they're going to watch the show. It gives people a way to access this story that I'm just like, has so profoundly like influenced the way I think about the world.
What did you love about it?
Oh man, where to start? Honestly, I got the feeling from that trilogy, the same feeling that I used to get when I read science fiction as a child, and which I have never recaptured except for that trilogy.
That's exactly the feeling.
Yeah.
I've never been able to put my finger on it to this day, but I think you nailed it. That might be, you feel your mind being expanded and stretched in a way that feels very difficult to recapture in adulthood. You're right. I think that captures exactly what's so interesting about it.
And it grapples with so many interesting ideas. I'll read in like sort of obsessive bursts about certain subjects. And one thing that I'm kind of interested in right now is this idea of defeatism, and like what that does to people. This factors heavily into the book series, and there's a whole like technology developed to fight defeatism. But I'm reading The Splendid and the Vile right now, and people don't recall this or think about it today, but like when the Battle of Britain was being waged, like Britain had very slim odds. The prevailing wisdom and consensus was that they were going to get steamrolled by the Luftwaffe. And Churchill had to like contend with this defeatism everywhere, and he would not have it. He was just like, victory is the only option. And then I think about this today in the context of AI too. Like this whole like doomer trend, it's so defeatist. It comes from this defeatist place that sort of like grates against my soul. And so it's interesting to read about how other times grappled with this idea and managed to get ahead of it.
There's also a cultural sense to this. I do agree on the cultural swings of the book. What I found very fascinating, besides the science fiction and the technology, and you're right, they developed that technology for defeatism because the inevitability of aliens coming for you and waiting for eons to counter that future. You feel trapped, and yet can you do something? But there are three ideas that really stuck to me as so fascinating in that book. One was the idea that aliens could not lie, at least at first.
Oh, yeah.
And that humans were the only ones that can lie. And that was one edge that humans had over AI and aliens and artificial intelligences.
It's so like core to being human. You know, it goes back to like the Odyssey with Ulysses, like lying to the Cyclops, you know?
Or Penelope with her suitors and Odysseus. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then like, similarly, there is another thing about how the solution, like there's a fourth fanfic book by Bao Shu, The Redemption of Time, that was approved by Cixin Liu as being like the canonical for the series, but it's not by him. But that book tells his story, the character who's on the alien ship. But what's really fascinating is that he sends these stories that are decoded ways of defeating the aliens in book 3. And that was also really remarkable to me.
And by the way, coming from Cixin Liu, who's writing from China, which has a vast censorship regime, it adds so many layers of complexity and meta nuance that are just so delicious.
Totally. I mean, longtime listeners of the A6 and Z podcast, the show that I built and grew before, I recorded an episode on live streaming, and it talks about how a lot of youth in China were using expression with emojis and bananas and other things as ways to get around censors. And it's true. That's a very great point, because it's like they were fighting the aliens and they had this coded language to the stories. But the third is something that I think a lot of readers of science fiction will appreciate, which is, I don't remember who said that quote about the goal of the science fiction writer is not to predict the automobile, but the traffic jam. I've completely mangled it. But the point was like the social implications and consequences of technology. And what's great about the 3-Body Problem trilogy is that he does this really interesting showing of what happens to gender and society, like men becoming more masculine and men becoming more effeminate and all this cool stuff, like in waves of culture that I've never seen in any science fiction.
I so totally agree.
Right? That was so cool.
What does it say about us today that like K-pop boy bands and Timothée Chalamet are our like idols and icons?
Oh, I've had this very much rant about Timothée Chalamet. Like, why is that the icon now of like hero man?
What happened to Sean Connery and his super hairy chest? Steph, you scrunched your face up.
Just in reference to the super hairy chest.
Yeah, come on. Yeah, he talks about like masculine eras and feminine eras. And like how people's physiology will change with respect to whatever is the prevail. And it kind of goes back to defeatism too. And sort of like whether you're born in a time where it's rugged and rough and like it's all about survival, or whether it's complacent and like you're resigned to something. And anyway, it's all about the yin and the yang too.
It goes back to defeatism because it also goes to like a hope. Because the other idea there is like this cleodynamics idea of like history and time at extremely large scales, because the story is told at an extremely large scale, in fact, many millions of years, not even hundreds of years. And so the other idea there is that sometimes the things that happen on a world stage, if you look at it only in a narrow lens, you may feel very differently about it than if you look at it in like global, like long scales too.
I want to add one more point on 3-Body Problem before we pivot.
Go to town. Go.
Which is my wife and I recently had a child, and we would refer in the early stages of his life to the periods when he was awake as a chaotic era and periods when he was asleep as a stable era. So I want to throw that in there.
Okay, I'll say one last thing on 3-Body Problem, and then I promise we can put a pin on this. The other idea that's fascinating is the concept of a wall facer that comes up in book 2.
Yes.
And the idea, I mean, not to drastically simplify it, but that a person's job is to like kind of face a wall and come up with unique ideas to solve a problem. I did this tweet storm that draws a parallel to wall facers and innovation in companies. Like, can you actually have innovation happen in this model of a wall facer, and why that doesn't work and what does work about it? Because it ties to R&D. But I think that idea in book 2 is also very interesting. Steph and Tim, have we either made you want to read the books or not want to read the books after hearing us jam about that for a bit?
I read the first book.
And chose not to continue.
And I did not
It's
continue.
a 3 body problem.
Just the first body problem.
Yeah. But 2 of my kids read all 3 books and love the trilogy. And so, that speaks to it going to the bottom of my pile, apparently. And I will eventually read them.
Like I said, great heuristic. By the way, speaking of the trilogy, Tim, when you say you read the first book, it's funny because one of my heuristics or kind of tests for people is whether they like the second book or the third book more. And Robert, I'm going to ask you this question because to me, it's the equivalent of when you ask people who love Star Wars, did you like Empire Strikes Back better or Return of the Jedi? It tells you so much about a person.
Empire Strikes Back every time.
I knew you would say that. But for me, it's Return of the Jedi.
Empire Strikes Back, Two Towers in Lord of the Rings, and Dark Forest in 3 body problem.
Those are the only right answers. I can't speak to Dark Forest, but for the other 2, you can't have other answers.
So that's the thing. Literary people will always pick the middle of the story, as they should. Empire Strikes Back is the right answer, so you say. Same with Dark Forest. Everyone will pick it. But I realize about myself that I like to think I'm literary, but my tastes are very lowbrow because my favorite is definitely Return of the Jedi. And I also loved Jet's End and the series ending.
The Ewoks were cute. I'll give you that. They were very cute.
Or cloying. I mean, take your pick.
I like Return of the Jedi better too.
Oh,
Pro
yay,
Ewok.
Steph, I have someone in my camp. I thought I was the only one. Because Empire Strikes Back is superior storytelling, and same with Dark Forest. But the ending, the way they wrap everything up in Jet's End in the trilogy, it's just too good to not love.
We could do a whole podcast just on that one series, by the
We
way.
could. By the way, this is so much fun. I feel like this is the best of us. It's like we're bringing all of our true energy.
Should we talk about genres?
Are there any that come to mind for each of you? Like, is there a go-to genre for you or a genre that you will never touch?
I mean, I read tons of fantasy. I read tons of science fiction. I like police procedurals.
You do?
I love police procedurals. The darker, the better. I like spy novels. Those are all like things I read just like one after another.
Any favorite spy authors? That's a really popular genre among many.
Oh, I really like Olin Steinauer, who's an American who lives in the Czech Republic now, maybe. But he writes across 20th century spy novels. They're super fun.
I love fantasy. I like gothic horror specifically. Anything with like creaky staircases, someone buried behind a wall, like all of this stuff I'm very excited about.
Not surprising that you're rereading Dracula right now.
Dracula is one of my favorite novels for sure.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of mine, but I don't think of that as gothic. I think it's like technically romantic literature.
So, as mentioned before, I'm kind of obsessed and addicted to nonfiction. Like, I just consume it at fast speeds all day long. You mentioned Mark Andreessen, like a lot of people read his books, the books that he recommends. I feel like I'm constantly playing catch up with all of his recommendations. In fact, I wonder if he's just like DDoS attacking us all with all of these recommendations, because how can one man actually imbibe all that information?
I often will use him as my one-man book recommender system. I will literally just be like, Mark, I need a book on X. Can you make a recommendation? And like 2 minutes later, I'll get like 3 good books from him. It's like Mark will always have a great suggestion for some particular topic. It's true. He's very good at that.
So beyond nonfiction, I will say that I savor a certain type of literature that, and I alluded to this earlier, that involves puzzles. So like, look, I like James Joyce. I like Thomas Pynchon. I like Vladimir Nabokov. I like people who lay traps and hints and clues, and the reading of a text becomes sort of like a game in itself, where you're trying to interpret it at a sort of like, at one level, there's like the plot, but then at a higher level, there's like all the weird symbolism and conflicting things going on, the different ways you could interpret the text. I like that kind of stuff. I don't think it's productive, but it's fun.
I'm going to say, I feel like people shouldn't be productive. Like when we talk about all the books about productivity hacks, it's like there should be parts of our lives that are little treats and we get to, just enjoy them for the sake of enjoying them and having them to ourselves. So I don't think there should be any shame in not doing something productive for sure.
I like that.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I totally agree too. I would say that the puzzle books you describe, they feel like too much work to me. And I want books that I don't have to work to read, which is why I also, like Tim and Steph, absolutely love fantasy as a genre. And even sci-fi can feel like a lot of work. So sci-fi I'm very selective about because I don't want to be only intellectually stretched. Sometimes I just want to read a good escape book. I don't have a genre I won't read, but I think the genre that I'm surprised that I'm reading more and more in the last 5 years is bios and memoirs. And I never thought I would like that. I used to think stories about people were so boring as a kid growing up. And now I find these inner minds, whether written by the person autobiographically or written about them, really well done and in detail, to be just an addictive genre for me, and particularly in audiobooks, because there's something more compelling about them in audio.
There's a reason so many bestsellers are memoirs and biographies.
Yeah, I already mentioned Trevor Noah's book. I don't even know him as a comedian or his political views or anything about him, but that memoir was excellent. It's like very addictive. Have you guys all read it?
Nope.
No.
Yeah, I just think you won't be able to put it down. It's just so well done and gripping and interesting. I like bios that are also stories of a place. They're a way to hear a history of a place through the lens of a single character that makes it concrete. And I also love that about fiction. Like, that's what I loved about the Ferrante Quartet. And Steph, you mentioned earlier that you like historical, some of the fantasy that has a bit of a historical flair. I think that's very similar.
I have a question. What are books that you've read and enjoyed that weren't recommended to you, that you just like found and started reading?
Like were anti-recommended to us, or just that we're not?
Maybe not actively like campaigned against, but like that you just found on your own and did not come from a recommendation. Surprising gem.
Okay.
I have one that I read recently. I had finished everything I had brought with me on a trip, and I was in an airport and spent a lot of time in what actually ended up being a pretty well-stocked bookstore, and I picked up a book called American Mermaid, which I really enjoyed. It was nominally about a woman who wrote a book called American Mermaid, and then it gets optioned for a movie, and she has to go off to Hollywood to figure out how her book is going to be turned into a movie, and things go awry. But it also has kind of a meta layer of maybe the mermaid she wrote comes alive. But I really enjoyed it. It was great.
So one thing I like, a pastime of mine that I really enjoy, is when I rent a place like on Airbnb or whatever, go to the bookshelf, check it out, and then like whatever's there, I pick something and that becomes my book for the week.
That's
and
cool.
I've had some good winners come out of that, including recently I was down in Miami, and the place had a coffee table book that was all of the first pages, the front pages of the New York Times from like the start of the publication. And to read about history in the first-hand account at the time is wild. Like, I was reading about like, Commodore Matthew Perry opening up Japan, and like the way they told news stories, it was not the most important information first. It's like you bumped into your neighbor and they were like, here's what happened to me today. First this happened, then that happened. And then like 8 paragraphs in, it says something important. And you're like, well, why did you bury the lead there? It's like, because they had no concept of a lead. It's just like some person writing from beginning to end what happened. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's one thing I like to do. And one gem that came to me by that method.
That is so cool and interesting. Jeff, answer your own question. I'm curious for your answer to that.
One of them, and this is not really like a book that nobody knows about, but it was Slade House by David Mitchell, who actually wrote Cloud Atlas,
right?
And Bone Clocks.
Oh, Bone Clocks.
Which they're known for. But Slade House, I thought of it because we mentioned Gothic novels, and it's a little bit like a Gothic novel. It goes through like a history of people who've been ensnared by these nefarious creatures in a house. So more specifically, it's about some people throughout history or throughout time, throughout decades, that were kind of ensnared by these like twin vampires. And I like greatly enjoyed it. Like I read the paperback copy and then I listened to the audiobook with my husband when we were on a long trip and it was fall. There's like orange leaves on the trees that were falling on the car and we were listening to this like moody audiobook and it was very pleasant.
That's a vibe. Sonal, I want to hear your answer to this question.
I was thinking about my answer and I realized that I do pick up surprising gems all the time in bookstores. And I'm not into poetry at all, but weirdly, the ones that I pick up that are surprising gems are poetry. And one of the ones that I remember from about a decade ago was reading Love and Index, which is a set of poems that were just very moving. And so weirdly, all my surprising gems are poems.
So, Tim, I want to ask you too, as somebody who has edited so many books and who has authored several books himself, how does that change your relationship with reading? I'm heartened to hear that you continue to be an active, avid reader. How does that change the way you approach a hobby?
That's an interesting question. I think when I was very actively editing or publishing, then it's hard to read the kind of book that you're editing without wanting to edit it. I think that's something a lot of writers and editors go through. When you first start editing and you're, proofreading menus at restaurants and you can't help yourself. But try to remove myself from how I would do this and try to respect the choices that were made when you're reading the book. And then I don't read a lot of the kind of books I used to edit. I did really serious nonfiction, economic sociology, politics, and I tend not to read those kinds of books in my spare time. I don't know. I don't have an aversion to them, but I just don't approach them anymore.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Tim, because I found with magazine editing, I felt way less joy in reading magazines. And I used to love reading magazines like Vanity Fair. And once I started working in one, all the magic of that went away. But now I treat Substacks or newsletters like magazines, like pleasurable Sunday reads. And one of my favorites for sure is Airmail, which is actually not on Substack, but it's co-founded by the OG Vanity Fair, not the Tina Brown, but the Graydon Carter era. That's like my favorite Vanity Fair. And I love that I get to scratch that itch with Airmail. We didn't talk about newsletters. That's maybe beyond the scope of this episode. But if you guys did want to quickly add any newsletters or things that you like reading, it is what we're reading.
Web3 Weekly by A16Z Crypto.
That too is my favorite newsletter.
Well, let's wrap up. Maybe as a way to wrap up, let's do a quick round robin of what's on your list to read next that you haven't read yet, that you're excited to read.
I think I will pick up. So I really like James Rebank's Shepherd's Life. He wrote about the life of a shepherd in the UK. It's a memoir-ish book that I read a few years ago and really liked. And I have his follow-up Pastoral Song, which is, I think, more of the same, but I'm not really sure. I'm just there for the writing and the pastoralness.
Where in England is he? I was just in the Cotswolds, which is partly why I was so into Tolkien.
Yeah, no, he's north, but I could not tell you exactly where, but not in the Cotswolds.
Okay. Well, sheep are cool. They're very nice.
Oh, I don't like sheep at all.
I saw a lot of sheep when I was there.
Anti-sheep.
Weird dead eyes.
Yeah. They're scared all the time of everything.
Well, what about goats? They've got those weird rectangular pupils. Like, what's going on there? That's not
goats
okay.
Goats are nature's clowns. Sheep are just bad.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
That's so cute. So I just started Lee Bardugo's The Familiar, which is another fantasy book.
Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
I'm like on the third chapter. I'm like at the beginning.
We're like in the same spot. I literally just finishing this last night. I love her books, and my favorite by far is the Six of Crows duologies.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's like so funny.
Yeah, I just started it, but I'm also looking forward to, there's a book coming out in July, Lev Grossman's Bright Sword. He's the author of The Magicians, that trilogy. It's supposed to be a very meaty book, but the reviews seem promising, so I'm excited for that one. Oh, it's set in King Arthur's court too.
Fun.
Okay, so I just got a book called, I think it's The Road to Reality is the title. And it's by a famous mathematician, Roger Penrose. And it's basically like he lays out the laws of the universe in a way that presumably you can understand. It's a thick book, but it's sort of a crash course on like everything you need to know to understand the universe. It's very math heavy, apparently. But I've got a friend who recently spent a year basically going through this book and then like learning in his own syllabus, each chapter, kind of like going on YouTube and watching lessons. So anyway, he's given me this whole thing. I'm going to do it for a period of time. He just got a tattoo of like Faraday's electromagnetism laws on his forearm. So, I mean, if you're going to tattoo yourself over a book, I feel like that's a pretty good testimonial, right?
Very cool.
Is it cool?
Is it though?
Nah.
Yeah.
This was such a blast, you guys. And what a fun team to be able to jam with us about.
This was very fun. Yeah. Thanks everybody for chatting. This has been great.
Thanks. It was super fun.
I had an awesome time, guys.
Thanks, team. Thanks, everyone.